To the world, he was the ultimate symbol of courage. He was the king who rode his horse through the forest of Nazi bayonets, holding his head high to defend Denmark's dignity. A hero. But when the heavy gates of Amalienborg palace swung shut, the hero dissolved and the jailer appeared. Christian X. A man possessed by power and a pathological need for perfection. At his dinner table, a minute's delay was a felony. A misplaced laugh was an insult. He ruled his family with an iron discipline that made even his own son tremble when lifting a fork. How could a king revered by an entire nation be the nightmare of those he supposedly loved most? How did one man's ego nearly trigger a constitutional showdown that put the monarchy itself at risk? Put aside the myths. Today we step into the frozen dining room of Christian X, where he was not the people's king, but the family tyrant. History loves a binary narrative, the good king versus the evil occupier, but the human heart is rarely so simple. The tragedy of Christian X was not that he was a bad man in the conventional sense. He was not a debauched hedonist like some of his European cousins, nor was he cruel for the sake of cruelty. His toxicity was born of a warped sense of duty, a belief that affection was a weakness, and that the only way to love a family or a country was to grip it so tightly that it could not move. He was a man possessed by a demon of order. In his mind, the world was a chaotic, dangerous place that could only be held together by schedules, uniforms, and unyielding hierarchy. He did not see himself as a tyrant. He saw himself as the only sentry awake at the post, the only one taking life seriously enough to ensure that the standards were met. He was the victim of his own terrifying perfectionism, and he made sure that everyone around him paid the price for it. The roots of this emotional frostbite lay deep in the soil of the late 19th century. Born in 1870 at Charlottenlund Palace, Prince Christian entered a world where the Danish monarchy was in a precarious state of rehabilitation. The House of Glücksburg was new to the throne, imported to replace the extinct Oldenburg line, and they sat uneasily upon the dais. They were the poor relations of European royalty, anxious to prove their legitimacy through impeccable behavior. Young Christian absorbed this anxiety into his marrow. From his earliest years, he was taught that he was not a child, but a vessel for the dignity of the state. There was no room for error. While other children learned to play, Christian learned to stand still. He was a tall, solemn boy, lacking the natural charm that greased the wheels of social interaction. He found the messiness of human emotion confusing, frightening even, and so he retreated into the safety of rules. The military was not just a career choice for him, it was a psychological refuge. In the barracks, everything made sense. Rank was visible. Orders were absolute. If you followed the procedure, you were safe. He fell in love with the clarity of the drill square, and tragically, he decided to bring that drill square home. This rigid personality was calcified by a lifelong simmering rivalry with his younger brother, Prince Karl. In the theater of family dysfunction, roles are often assigned at birth, and in the Danish nursery, the lines were drawn early. Christian was the heir, stoic, dutiful, heavy, and dull. Karl was the spare, charming, handsome, witty, and effortlessly popular. Christian worked for respect. Karl simply breathed and was adored. It is a poisonous dynamic that has played out in royal houses for a millennium, but in Christian, it produced a specific kind of narcissistic injury. He looked at his brother and saw everything he was not. He saw how easily Karl laughed, how people leaned in when he spoke, how the stiff etiquette of the court seemed to bend around Karl's charisma, while Christian remained trapped by it. The future king developed a deep-seated insecurity, a fear that he was fundamentally unlovable, which he masked with an armor of arrogance. If he could not be the most beloved, he would be the most correct. He would be the most punctual, the most disciplined, the most kingly. He would crush his own jealousy under the weight of his superior morality. The pivotal moment that turned this sibling rivalry into a permanent psychological scar occurred in 1905. The newly independent nation of Norway was looking for a king. Through a combination of diplomatic maneuvering and popular acclaim, the offer fell not to the senior branch, but to the charismatic younger brother. Prince Karl was elected King Haakon VII of Norway. He had achieved a throne not by the grim accident of primogeniture, but by the will of the people. He was a modern democratic monarch, validated by a landslide referendum. For Christian, who was still merely the crown prince of Denmark, waiting for his father to die, this was a humiliation that burned like acid. His younger brother had outranked him. Haakon was a king. Christian was still a subordinate. The jealousy curdled into a cold, hard resentment. Christian convinced himself that Haakon's popularity was cheap, a result of pandering to the masses, whereas he, Christian, represented the true divinely ordained dignity of kingship. He doubled down on his rigidity. He would not be a popular king. He would be a formidable one. He would prove that his way, the way of iron and silence, was superior. When Christian finally ascended the Danish throne in 1912, he brought this baggage with him, unloading it onto the inhabitants of Amalienborg. The palace ceased to be a home and became a clockwork mechanism. The king's behavior, what a modern clinician might describe as obsessive, rigid, and controlling, dictated the rhythm of existence. He was obsessed with time. He did not view punctuality as a courtesy. He viewed it as a moral absolute, a test of character that one passed or failed every single hour. He would stand with his watch in hand, waiting for a family member to be late by 10 seconds so he could unleash a sermon on duty and sloth. This was not about efficiency. It was about control. By controlling time, he controlled the bodies and minds of everyone in his orbit. If he could make them anxious about the minute hand, he owned their attention. His wife, Queen Alexandrine of Mecklenburg-Schwerin, was the primary casualty of this regime. History often paints her as a mouse, a weak woman who allowed herself to be bullied, but this does a disservice to the immense emotional labor she performed to keep the family from shattering. Alexandrine was a woman of profound patience and quiet strength, who realized early in her marriage that her husband was a man who could not be fought with fire. To confront Christian X was to invite an explosion that could last for days, a silent treatment where he would ignore her presence entirely, moving through her as if she were a ghost, punishing her with a withholding of contact that was far more painful than shouting. So she adopted the strategy of the willow tree. She bent. She smoothed the waters. She signaled to the children with her eyes when Papa was in a mood. She created small pockets of warmth in the palace when he was away, moments of laughter that would be instantly extinguished the moment his heavy footsteps were heard in the hallway. She enabled his tyranny, yes, but she did so to survive it. But the king's true project, the focus of his most intense and damaging scrutiny, was his eldest son, Crown Prince Frederick. If Christian X saw himself as the perfection of monarchy, he looked at his son and saw a project that was failing. Frederick was a disappointment from the start. He was not the steely, soldierly clone Christian had wanted. Frederick was sensitive. He had a soul that vibrated to music rather than marching orders. He loved the piano. He dreamed of conducting orchestras. He had a sailor's heart drawn to the sea, not for its discipline, but for its freedom. To Christian, These artistic inclinations were not just hobbies. They were character flaws. They were effeminate. They were soft. And in Christians' worldview, softness was the precursor to ruin. The abuse of Frederick was systematic and relentless. It was a grinding down of the spirit. The king mocked his son's interests in front of the court. When Frederick expressed an interest in music, Christians sneered that it was a pastime for schoolgirls, not future kings. He controlled Frederick's finances with a miserly grip well into the prince's adulthood, forcing the future monarch to come to him for every krone, infantilizing him, making him beg for the means to live his life. The message was reinforced daily. You are nothing without me. You are incompetent. You are weak. The king's physical presence alone was a weapon. Christian was 6 feet 6 inches tall, a towering physical specimen who used his size to intimidate. Frederick, though tall himself, learned to physically recoil in his father's presence. There are photographs of the two men together where the body language is screaming. The father puffing out his chest, dominant, occupying the space. The son slightly hunched, eyes averted, protecting his vital organs from an invisible blow. The dining room remained the epicenter of this domestic terror. Dinner at the palace was a ritual of fear. The king would sit at the head, eating with mechanical precision. He demanded that conversation be directed by him, but often he chose not to speak at all. The silence would stretch out, agonizing and thin. The children, Frederick and his younger brother Knud, would eat with their eyes on their plates, terrified that the sound of a knife scraping porcelain would draw the gaze. When Christian did speak, it was often to correct. He would criticize the way Frederick held his fork. He would criticize the cut of his uniform. He would ask a question about a military protocol he knew Frederick had forgotten, setting a trap just to watch his son stumble, and then deliver the verdict: hopeless. The staff standing in the shadows would look away, humiliated on behalf of the crown prince. To witness the future king of Denmark being dressed down like a naughty schoolboy by his father was a spectacle that stripped the monarchy of its magic and left only the ugly bones of a dysfunctional family. One often repeated account from the 1920s captures the logic of his control. A grown son, uniformed and ready, still ordered back to the family table. We dine at 6. You are part of this family. You will sit at my table. There was no reason for the refusal other than the exercise of power. Frederick, a naval officer who commanded men at sea, crumbled. He went back to his room, took off his coat, and sat at the dinner table at 6 o'clock, staring into the abyss of his father's will. This need for control extended to the spiritual life of the nation as well. Christian X was a man of old-fashioned, almost feudal piety. He believed that he had a direct line to God, and that God, much like himself, was a stickler for rules. He viewed the rising tide of modernity, jazz music, short skirts, socialism, the relaxation of social mores, as a personal affront. He felt he was holding back the floodwaters of chaos. This is where the tragedy of his character becomes almost sympathetic in its delusion. He truly believed that if he relaxed his grip for even a second, if he allowed Frederick to be a musician, if he allowed the Queen to be late, if he allowed the Parliament to do as it pleased, the entire structure of civilization would collapse. He was a man driven by a profound existential panic that he masked as strength. He believed only he could hold the world together, yet that grip was crushing the people closest to him. As the decade of the 1910s bled into the 1920s, the king's rigidity began to chafe against the changing world outside the palace gates. Europe had been broken by the Great War. Empires had fallen. The Romanovs were dead. The Hohenzollerns were in exile. The age of the absolute monarch was over. But Christian IX refused to read the writing on the wall. He looked at the chaos of Europe and concluded that the problem was not too much monarchy, but too little. He believed the world needed more discipline, more of his brand of iron rectitude. He became increasingly critical of his own government, treating his prime ministers with the same condescending impatience he reserved for his sons. He began to interfere in politics, pushing the boundaries of the Constitution, convinced that he knew better than the elected representatives of the people. Inside the palace, the atmosphere darkened as the king aged. His temper became shorter, his moods blacker. He began to view his family not just as subordinates, but as potential traitors who were waiting for him to falter. He became suspicious, monitoring their movements, demanding to know who they spoke to and what they read. The toxic nature of his personality metastasized. It was no longer just about order. It was about dominance. He needed to win every interaction. If Frederick had a success in the Navy, Christian would find a way to minimize it. If Knud married, Christian would criticize the match. He withheld praise as if it were a finite resource that, if spent, would bankrupt the crown. The psychological toll on Crown Prince Frederick was immense. He developed a nervous tic. He drank more than he should have, seeking a chemical release from the constant anxiety. He sought solace in the company of unsuitable women, small rebellions that were desperate cries for autonomy. But he never openly defied his father. The fear was too deep. The indoctrination was too complete. Christian had successfully built a prison in his son's mind, the bars made of duty and guilt. But a storm was gathering. The king's belief in his own infallibility, nurtured in the greenhouse of his terrified family, was about to be tested in the cold light of national politics. What he practiced at home, control without compromise, he now tried to practice on the state. He looked at the map of Denmark and he saw a flaw, a border that offended his sense of geometry and justice. And just as he corrected the placement of a fork or the posture of a prince, he decided he would correct the map of Europe. He did not know it yet, but his obsession with control was about to lead him to the precipice of treason. The stage was set for the Easter crisis, the moment when the man who ruled his table by fear tried to override Parliament and discovered a nation is not a child. The transition from the dining room to the throne room was, for King Christian X, a distinction without a difference. He viewed the Danish parliament much as he viewed his own kitchen staff, necessary, occasionally incompetent, and ultimately there to serve his will. The toxicity that poisoned the air at Amalienborg, the obsession with control, the inability to compromise, the narcissistic conviction that he alone possessed the moral compass to navigate the storm, was about to bleed out into the streets of Copenhagen. The domestic tyrant was tired of small victories over his terrified children. He hungered for a triumph that would be carved into the bedrock of history. He did not want to be merely a constitutional monarch who signed papers and cut ribbons. He wanted to be a warrior king, a reunifier, a man who redrew the map of Europe with the stroke of a pen. The catalyst for this catastrophic overreach was the end of the Great War. The world in 1918 was a smoking ruin, but from the ashes, opportunity rose, like a phoenix for the Danish nationalists. For 50 years, since the disastrous War of 1864, the southern province of Schleswig had been lost to the Germans. It was a national wound that had never healed, a phantom limb that ached in the Danish collective memory. With Germany defeated and the Kaiser in exile, the chance to reclaim this stolen land was suddenly real. The victorious Allies, through the Treaty of Versailles, decreed that the fate of Schleswig would be decided by a democratic referendum. The people would choose Denmark or Germany. For Christian X, this was not a political process. It was a divine restoration. He looked at the map of Schleswig and saw his legacy. He imagined himself riding across the old border on a white horse, the conquering hero returning the lost sheep to the fold. His pride swelled. This would be the act that silenced his critics, the act that proved he was greater than his charming brother, Håkon. He would not just be the king of Denmark, he would be the king of a whole Denmark. However, democracy is a messy business, and it rarely aligns with the clean, absolute dreams of autocrats. The referendum was held in 2 zones. In Zone 1, northern Schleswig, the result was a landslide. 75% voted to return to Denmark. The king rejoiced. But then came the vote in Zone 2, central Schleswig, which included the historic city of Flensburg. The result was a crushing disappointment for the nationalists. 80% voted to remain German. The Danish government, led by the Prime Minister Carl Theodor Zahle, was a coalition of social liberals and social democrats. Zahle was a pragmatist. He looked at the numbers and accepted reality. Northern Schleswig would come home, central Schleswig would stay with Germany. To grab land where the majority of the population was German would only sow the seeds of future conflict. It was a sensible, modern, democratic decision. But Christian X was not a sensible, modern, democratic man. He was a man who screamed at his wife if the soup was cold. When he heard that Flensburg would be left behind, his obsessive-compulsive need for completeness triggered a rage that was both personal and political. He could not accept a partial victory. He wanted Flensburg. He felt a sentimental, almost mystical attachment to the city, despite the fact that its people had explicitly rejected him. To leave it in German hands felt to him like a personal insult, a dereliction of duty. The traits that poisoned his private life now spilled into national politics: control, rigidity, and a hunger to dominate. He began to surround himself with conservative nationalists who fed his ego, whispering that the government was weak, that Zahle was a traitor, and that the king knew better than the ballot box. They played to his narcissism, convincing him that he was the true voice of the people, even if the actual people had voted otherwise. The echo chamber of the court amplified his worst instincts. He stopped listening to his ministers and started issuing demands. The collision course was set. In the spring of 1920, the tension inside Amalienborg was palpable. The king paced the floors, his heavy boots echoing on the parquet. He was no longer just the grumpy father. He was a coiled spring. He bullied his son Frederick about his naval duties with renewed vigor, transferring his political frustration onto the nearest available target. The queen walked on eggshells, sensing that her husband was working himself up to a detonation that would shatter more than just the dinner crockery. On March 29, 1920, the explosion occurred. The king summoned Prime Minister Zahle to the palace. It was not a meeting. It was an ambush. Christian X demanded that Zahle dissolve parliament and call new elections, hoping that a more nationalist government would sweep into power and annex Flensburg regardless of the vote. Zahle, a man of principle who respected the Constitution, refused. He argued that the government still held a majority and that the king had no right to interfere in the political process. The king's reaction was terrifying. His face flushed with the purple rage that his children knew so well. He stood up, his immense height filling the room, and unleashed the full force of his authoritarian personality. "Then I have no use for you," he roared. In a moment of madness, driven by an ego that could not comprehend the word no, Christian X fired the entire government on the spot. It was a constitutional rupture, a royal overreach that pushed Denmark to the brink and threatened the monarchy itself. The king had unilaterally dismissed a democratically elected government simply because they disagreed with him. He dismissed the elected cabinet and installed a caretaker ministry, an act widely seen as a dangerous breach of democratic practice. For a few hours, Christian X felt a surge of triumphant power. He had done it. He had acted like a real king. He had asserted his will over the squabbling politicians. He surely imagined that the people would cheer him, that they would flock to the palace gates to thank him for his strength. He was wrong. Catastrophically, delusionally wrong. The reaction of the Danish people was instantaneous and furious. The king had fundamentally misread the 20th century. This was not 1660. The people were not serfs. They were citizens who had just watched Europe destroy itself in a war started by arrogant emperors, and they had no desire to see their own democracy dismantled by a man who treated the Constitution like a suggestion. The news of the dismissal hit Copenhagen like a bomb. The Social Democrats and the trade unions mobilized immediately. The cry went up, "Down with the king!" It was a chant that had not been heard in Denmark for centuries. Crowds began to gather in the square outside Amalienborg, but they were not cheering. They were shouting threats. The word republic was being spoken openly, not just in the dark corners of radical meeting halls, but in the editorial pages of major newspapers. The trade unions threatened a general strike that would paralyze the entire nation. No trains, no electricity, no food distribution. Inside the palace, the atmosphere shifted from triumph to terror with dizzying speed. The king, who had been so sure of his popularity, looked out the window and saw a sea of angry faces. He saw the red flags of socialism. He heard the roar of a populace that had suddenly realized their father was actually a bully. The Easter crisis, as it came to be known, revealed the fragility of Christian X's narcissism. Like all bullies, his strength was brittle. It relied on the submission of others. When the victim fought back, when the child, the nation, stood up to the father, the tyrant's confidence collapsed. For 5 days, Denmark teetered on the brink of revolution. The monarchy, an institution that had survived 1,000 years, was days away from being abolished. The king's advisors, the same men who had egged him on, now looked at the floor, pale and trembling. They realized they had led the king off a cliff. But the most fascinating drama was happening in the king's mind. We can imagine him in his study, the sounds of the protest drifting through the heavy velvet curtains. This was the ultimate cognitive dissonance. He believed he was the hero, yet he was being treated as the villain. His rigid worldview, where he was always right and everyone else was undisciplined, could not process this reality. He was forced to confront the fact that he was not the omnipotent patriarch he thought he was. He was an employee of the state, and he was about to be fired. The pressure from the streets became unbearable. The threat of the general strike was the final straw. On April 4th, faced with the total collapse of his kingdom, the Iron King broke. He summoned the leaders of the opposition. He did not shout this time. He did not roar. He sat, diminished and humiliated, and agreed to their terms. He dismissed his puppet government. He accepted the results of the referendum. He effectively apologized to the nation, though the words likely tasted like ash in his mouth. The crisis ended as quickly as it had begun, but the damage was permanent. Christian X survived, but he was a gelded lion. He had been taught a brutal lesson in the limits of his power. He would remain king, but he would never again touch the levers of politics. He was forced back into the box of constitutional neutrality, a figurehead who could wave and smile, but never rule. The psychological impact of this public humiliation on a man with his personality profile cannot be overstated. A narcissist who suffers a public defeat does not learn humility. He learns bitterness. He retreats. He builds higher walls. Christian X retreated back into the domestic sphere, the one place where his power was still absolute. If he could not control the parliament, he would control the palace with even greater ferocity. The failure of the Easter crisis did not soften him. It hardened him. He became even more obsessed with the minutiae of family life, as if strictly regulating the dinner menu could compensate for his inability to regulate the border. The years following 1920 were the dark years for the family. The king, stripped of his political agency, turned his restless, critical eye entirely upon his sons. Crown Prince Frederick, now in his 20s, bore the brunt of his father's bruised ego. The king became a brooding presence, a man nursing a grudge against the modern world. He felt betrayed by his people, misunderstood by his ministers, and disappointed by his children. Yet there was a strange twist of irony in the aftermath. The Easter crisis had one positive outcome. Northern Schleswig was indeed returned to Denmark. In the summer of 1920, the official reunification ceremony took place. It was the moment Christian had dreamed of. He rode a white horse across the old border, lifting a little girl onto his saddle in a gesture of paternal protection. The crowds cheered wildly. The photographs from that day are iconic. The king, tall and majestic, the savior of the nation. But it was a lie. The cheers were for the return of the land, not for the king's political maneuvering. The people were celebrating the result of the democratic vote, while the king was celebrating a fantasy of his own power. He rode through the crowds with a stoic, unsmiling face, accepting the adulation that he felt he deserved, while privately seething that he had not been allowed to take the rest of the province. He had become a symbol, hollowed out. To the outside world, he was the reunion king. To the politicians, he was a dangerous amateur who had been put back in his place. But to his family, he was a wounded beast, pacing the cage of constitutional monarchy, looking for someone to bite. As the 1920s roared into the 1930s, the world began to darken again. A new kind of tyranny was rising in the South, a tyranny of shouting men in brown shirts. Christian X, from his isolation in Copenhagen, watched the rise of Hitler with the disdain of an old-school aristocrat. He despised the Nazis not because they were authoritarians. He understood authoritarianism well enough, but because they were vulgar. They were commoners who screamed. He found them distasteful. But while the world worried about the German dictator, the residents of Amalienborg were still worried about the Danish one. Life in the palace settled into a grim routine of walking on eggshells. The king's obsessive punctuality calcified into ritual. The silence at the dinner table deepened. Frederick married Princess Ingrid of Sweden in 1935, a match that brought a breath of fresh air into the stifling court. But even Ingrid, a strong and intelligent woman, found herself struggling to breathe in the vacuum of her father-in-law's presence. The king was aging. His body was beginning to fail, but his will remained unbreakable. He was a man out of time, a relic of the 19th century, stranded in a world of jazz, communism, and impending war. He was a social corpse in the political sense, allowed to exist only as a decoration. He needed a new war, a new crisis, something that would allow him to be useful again, something that would redeem the humiliation of 1920. He would get his wish. The tragedy of Christian X is that he was a man built for disaster. In times of peace, he was a monster. In times of crisis, he was a masterpiece. And the greatest crisis of all was marching toward the Danish border, wearing field gray and singing songs of conquest. The domestic tyrant was about to meet the only force on earth more rigid than himself. And in that collision, the bully would finally find his redemption. For on the dawn of April 9th, 1940, Denmark woke to a different kind of enemy, one with engines, uniforms, and a swastika. For the residents of Amalienborg Palace, the sound was confusing at first, a low mechanical thrum that vibrated in the window panes, growing steadily louder until it became a deafening scream. King Christian X, an old man of 70, awoke to a reality that his rigid world was ill-equipped to process. The Luftwaffe was overhead. The swastika was flying over the citadel. The German war machine, which had swallowed Poland and was currently digesting Norway, had turned its hungry eyes toward the flat, defenseless farmlands of Denmark. In the chaotic hours that followed, the king's character, that strange alloy of stubbornness, pride, and military fetishism, was put to the ultimate test. The Danish government, realizing the sheer hopelessness of resistance, capitulated within hours. It was a pragmatic decision to save Copenhagen from being bombed into rubble, but for a soldier king like Christian, it was a bitter pill that tasted of bile. He had spent his life preparing for duty, for honor, for the defense of the realm, and now he was being asked to surrender before breakfast. Yet, it was in this moment of national humiliation that the alchemy of Christian X's personality began to work its strange magic. The very traits that made him a monster in the dining room, his coldness, his arrogance, his absolute refusal to be charmed or intimidated, suddenly became the most valuable weapons in Denmark's arsenal. The Nazis, masters of psychological terror, had conquered nations with fear, but they had never met a man like Christian X. You cannot terrify a man who is already devoid of fear, a man whose ego is so monumental that he considers an invading army not a threat, but merely a breach of etiquette. When the German plenipotentiaries arrived at the palace expecting a cowed and trembling monarch, they were met instead with a wall of ice. Christian X did not shout, he did not plead. He treated the representatives of the Third Reich with the same withering disdain he had shown his son's music tutors. He looked at them as if they were mud on his boots. He refused to speak German to them, though he spoke it fluently. He refused to smile. He refused to offer the slightest warmth that might be interpreted as collaboration. He established the rules of engagement immediately. You may have my country, but you will never have me. This was the beginning of the cold shoulder, a policy of passive resistance that the king embodied with terrifying perfection. And then he did something that would transform him from a failed politician into a global icon. During the early occupation, he kept up his daily rides through Copenhagen, often without an escort, turning routine into defiance. He was an old man, alone, riding unarmed through a city occupied by the most ruthless military force in human history. It was a piece of theater so profound that it baffled the Germans. They didn't know what to do with him. If he had organized a resistance cell, they could have shot him. If he had given speeches, they could have censored him. But he was just riding. He was inspecting his capital, nodding to his subjects, accepting flowers from children, and utterly, completely ignoring the German soldiers. To the Wehrmacht troops standing on the street corners, he was a ghost who refused to acknowledge their existence. He looked right through them. It was a daily public humiliation of the occupiers. It said without a word, "I am still the king. You are just tourists with guns." For the Danish people, seeing their king on Jubilee became a spiritual lifeline. In the dark, suffocating years of the occupation, when the press was censored and the streets were full of foreign uniforms, the sight of that tall, stiff figure on the high horse was proof that Denmark was still alive. He became a living flag. The towering ego that ruled his home now served the nation. He became the symbolic center Denmark could rally around. His ego became the anchor that kept the country from drifting into despair. There is a famous story, likely apocryphal but spiritually true, that a German soldier asked a young Danish boy why the king rode without guards. "Why doesn't anyone harm him?" the soldier asked. The boy replied, "Because all of Denmark is his bodyguard." Whether the words were ever spoken is irrelevant. The sentiment was real. The king's vulnerability was his greatest strength. By exposing himself to danger every day, he dared the Germans to touch him, knowing that to harm the old man on the horse would turn the entire population into a chaotic, uncontrollable mob. But while the king was playing a heroic game of chicken with Hitler on the streets, life inside the palace remained a grim, claustrophobic ordeal. The occupation did not soften the domestic tyrant. If anything, it intensified his need for control. The world outside was chaotic and offensive. Therefore, the world inside Amalienborg had to be even more regimented. The blackout curtains were drawn tight every evening, sealing the family into a pressure cooker of tension. Crown Prince Frederick, now a man in his 40s, was forced into an even deeper state of subordination. The king, energized by his own resistance, treated his son's caution as cowardice. Frederick was trying to navigate the delicate politics of the situation, working with the government to keep the country running and prevent the Germans from taking direct control. Christian X viewed this pragmatism with suspicion. He wanted confrontation. He wanted honor. He would often berate Frederick for being too soft with the Germans, ignoring the fact that Frederick's diplomacy was the only thing keeping the king on his horse and out of a German prison. Even under occupation, the war at the table didn't end. His mood set the weather, and the family learned to live by it. The grandchildren, Frederick's 3 daughters, Margrethe, Benedicta, and Anne-Marie, were brought up in this atmosphere of hushed anxiety. They learned to be quiet around Grandpapa. They learned that the tall man in the uniform was a hero to the people, but a figure of fear in the nursery. By 1942, his pride found a new battlefield, one measured not in bullets, but in words. The zenith of Christian X's arrogant resistance came in 1942 in an incident known as the Telegram Crisis. It is a moment of dark comedy that perfectly illustrates the king's personality. Adolf Hitler, trying to woo the Nordic nations into his Aryan fantasy, sent a long, effusive telegram to Christian X on the king's 72nd birthday. It was a sycophantic message, full of praise and warmest regards from the Führer. Any other monarch in occupied Europe might have sent a polite diplomatic reply to avoid angering the dictator. Not Christian X. He viewed Hitler as a vulgar little corporal, a man with no breeding, an upstart. The king looked at the telegram and decided he couldn't be bothered. He dictated a reply that was a masterclass in aristocratic shade. He sent back, "Meinen besten Dank, Christian Rex. My best thanks, King Christian." That was it. 5 words. No Heil Hitler, no Your Excellency, no brother. Just a brush-off one would give to a nagging servant. When Hitler received the telegram in Berlin, he went into a frenzy. He was accustomed to fear and deference. To be dismissed with a terrifyingly brief thanks by the king of a tiny conquered nation was an insult he could not stomach. Hitler raged. He recalled the German ambassador from Copenhagen. He expelled the Danish ambassador from Berlin. He fired the mild-mannered German general in charge of Denmark and replaced him with a hardliner, General Hermann von Hanneken, with orders to crush the Danish spirit. The telegram crisis nearly caused the complete takeover of Denmark in 1942, months earlier than it eventually happened. It was a dangerous, reckless act. A more responsible king would have stroked Hitler's ego to save his people from wrath. But Christian X was not responsible. He was proud. His narcissism simply would not allow him to bow to a man he despised. And in a strange way, the Danish people loved him for it. They heard the rumors of how the king had snubbed Hitler, and they laughed. In the darkness of occupation, that laughter was oxygen. The king's rudeness had become a national treasure. However, the hero on horseback could not ride forever. The physical toll of the occupation, the stress of the constant performance, and the ravages of age were catching up with him. On October 19th, 1942, just weeks after the telegram crisis, the symbol finally cracked. It was a morning like any other. The king was on Jubilee, riding through the streets. The horse, usually calm, was perhaps spooked, or perhaps the king, distracted by the tightening noose of German control, lost his seat. Jubilee reared. The king, tall and heavy, fell hard to the cobblestones. The sound of the king hitting the ground was the sound of an era ending. He was carried back to the palace, broken and in agony. He would survive, but he would never ride again. The daily pageant was over. The visible symbol of resistance was removed from the streets, leaving a void that the people filled with anxiety. Confined to a wheelchair, trapped in the palace, Christian X's world shrank once more. He became a prisoner of his own palace, alive, revered, and yet increasingly irrelevant. The pain made him even more irritable. The domestic atmosphere at Amalienborg descended into a gloom that was almost Dickensian. The king sat in his study, a blanket over his legs, barking orders at a staff that moved in whispers. He felt useless. The Germans were taking over completely now. The model protectorate was over, replaced by martial law, executions, and the hunting of the Danish Jews. Yet, even in his invalid state, the king's shadow continued to cast a protective light. When the Germans decided to implement the final solution in Denmark in October 1943, planning to round up and deport the Jewish population, the king's previous stance made it clear where the moral line stood. While the legend that he wore the yellow Star of David is a myth, Jews in Denmark were never forced to wear it, largely because the Germans feared the Danish reaction. His private journals and public demeanor left no doubt. He considered the Jews to be his subjects, and an attack on them was an attack on him. This moral clarity trickled down. It emboldened the civil servants, the bishops, and the ordinary citizens who orchestrated the miraculous rescue of the Danish Jews, helping more than 95% of Denmark's Jews escape, roughly 7,200 to 7,500 people out of nearly 8,000, most of them to safety in Sweden. The king didn't drive the boats, but his stubborn, toxic ownership of his people created the umbrella under which the rescue could happen. He was possessive of his Danes, all of them, and he did not like anyone touching his property. As the war dragged into its final bloody years, Christian X faded into the background. He became a symbol of the past, a spectral figure appearing only on balconies, frail and gaunt. The torch of active leadership was passing to the resistance movement, and quietly to Crown Prince Frederick, who was finally beginning to step out of his father's shadow, managing the delicate relations with the Allies and the crumbling German hierarchy. But the king was not done terrorizing his family. Even as the British bombers flew overhead, signaling the coming liberation, Christian X held onto his domestic power with a death grip. He critiqued Frederick's speeches. He managed the household budget with miserly precision. He refused to let go. He was determined to die as he had lived, in charge, unquestioned, and feared. The liberation of May 5th, 1945, brought delirium to the streets of Denmark. The lights came back on. The German troops surrendered. The crowds surged to Amalienborg, chanting for their king. Christian Czechs was wheeled out onto the balcony. He wore his uniform, though it hung loosely on his frame now. He waved. The roar of the crowd was deafening, a wave of love and gratitude that washed over the old tyrant. In that moment, the paradox was complete. The people saw a saint. They saw the man who had stared down Hitler. They saw the savior of the nation. Standing just behind him in the shadows of the balcony door stood his family. They saw the man who had made their lives a misery for 30 years. They saw the bully. They saw the father who couldn't say, "I love you," only, "You are late." The war was won. The country was saved. But for the inhabitants of the House of Glucksburg, the liberation was only political. The personal liberation, the freedom from the emotional tyranny of Christian X, would only come with the grave. And the grave was waiting. The king was dying, his body finally surrendering to the inevitable, leaving behind a legacy that was as heavy, cold, and enduring as a statue of bronze. Yet, while the lights had returned to the streets of Copenhagen, the darkness inside Amalienborg remained. The war in Europe was over, but the quiet, grinding war of attrition between the domineering father and his damaged son continued without a ceasefire. The years between the liberation in May 1945 and the king's death in April 1947 were a strange twilight period for the Danish monarchy. To the public, Christian X was a living saint, a martyr who had sacrificed his health for the nation's honor. They saw the old man on the balcony, gaunt and trembling, and they wept with gratitude. They did not see the reality behind the glass doors. They did not see a man who, stripped of his physical strength and his external enemy, turned his formidable need for control inward, focusing it like a magnifying glass on the few people left within his reach. The winter of the patriarch had set in, and it was cold. Crown Prince Frederick was now nearing 50 years old. He was a man of immense physical stature, a decorated naval officer with tattoos on his arms and a love for conducting orchestras, a man of passion and warmth who should have been in the prime of his life. Yet in the presence of his father, this middle-aged man was still reduced to the status of a cadet. The dynamic had not matured. It had merely calcified. Christian X, unable to ride his horse or inspect his troops, inspected his son instead. He criticized Frederick's speeches for being too emotional. He critiqued the way Frederick raised his daughters, Margrethe, Benedicta, and Anne-Marie, claiming the girls were being spoiled because Frederick dared to show them physical affection, something Christian had viewed as a weakness to be purged. The tragedy of these final years lay in the absence of resolution. We are conditioned by literature and cinema to expect a deathbed softening, a moment where the tyrant looks at his heir with misty eyes and whispers, "I was hard on you because I loved you." Reality, particularly the reality of a personality as rigid as Christian's, offers no such comfort. There was no softening. There was only the continued relentless assertion of hierarchy. Christian X believed until his final breath that he was right, that his coldness was duty, that his bullying was mentorship, and that his son's desire for a happier, looser life was a defect in character. He did not view his parenting as a failure. He viewed Frederick's personality as the failure. The daily routine at the palace became a macabre dance around the dying king's moods. Christian spent his days in his study or his bedroom, surrounded by the artifacts of his reign, the military memorabilia, the maps, the clocks that still had to chime in perfect unison. He was in constant pain from the complications of his fall in 1942, and pain is a poor teacher of patience. He became irascible, snapping at nurses and valets. Queen Alexandrine, now an old woman herself, continued her lifelong role as the buffer zone, absorbing the shock waves of his temper so they wouldn't hit the children. She was the unsung heroine of the dynasty, a woman who had endured 40 years of emotional winter without ever letting her own warmth be extinguished. She sat by his bedside, knitting, reading to him, enduring his silences, a testament to a generation of royal women who viewed endurance as the highest form of love. The political landscape of post-war Denmark also irritated the dying king. He watched with suspicion as the country moved leftward. The Social Democrats were ascendant. The welfare state was being built. The old aristocratic order that Christian had fought to preserve in 1920 was finally dissolving into a modern, egalitarian democracy. He felt like a stranger in his own kingdom. The politicians paid him homage, but they no longer feared him. He was a museum piece, treated with the reverence one accords to a cracked vase, precious, but fragile and ultimately useless. This loss of relevance gnawed at him. A narcissist needs to be needed, and Christian X was discovering the terrifying truth that Denmark was doing just fine without him. Frederick, meanwhile, was living in a state of suspended animation. He was the shadow king, handling the day-to-day business of the monarchy, meeting with ministers, signing papers, yet always looking over his shoulder for the rebuke he knew was coming. He was terrified of the throne. He had spent his entire life being told he was incompetent, that he lacked the iron to rule. He had internalized his father's voice so deeply that he doubted his own ability to function without the tyrant's hand on his collar. He confided in friends that he dreaded the day the king would die, not just out of grief, but out of a fear that he would be exposed as a fraud. He felt he was an imposter in his own destiny. Yet Frederick had a secret weapon that his father never possessed: a happy marriage. His wife, Crown Princess Ingrid, was a formidable woman in her own right, intelligent, organized, and modern. She saw the damage Christian X inflicted on her husband, and she worked tirelessly to counteract it. She built a home life at their residence, Frederick VIII's palace. That was the antithesis of Christian's cold regime. It was a home full of music, laughter, and informality. It was a sanctuary where Frederick could take off the mask of the crown prince and just be Papa. Ingrid was the steel spine that Frederick lacked, constantly reminding him that the Danish people loved him for his warmth, not for his father's stiffness. She was preparing him to be a different kind of king, a king who could smile. As the spring of 1947 approached, the inevitable end began to announce itself. The king's heart, tired from 76 years of beating against the current of the world, began to fail. The atmosphere in Amalienborg shifted from anxiety to a solemn hush. The doctors came and went with grave faces. The bulletins were posted on the palace gates. The king's strength is failing. The death of a monolithic father figure is a complex psychological event. For the nation, it was a simple tragedy. Thousands of Danes gathered in the square outside the palace, standing in silent vigil. They remembered the Easter crisis only as a distant footnote. Mostly they remembered the horse, the starched uniform, the defiant glare at the Nazis. They were mourning the symbol of their survival. Inside the palace, the grief was far more knotted. Frederick stood by his father's bedside, watching the life ebb out of the man who had been the defining architect of his pain. There is a specific agonizing loneliness in watching a parent die when the relationship has been one of fear rather than love. You mourn the parent you had, but you also mourn the parent you never had. You mourn the conversations that never happened, the approval that never came. Frederick waited, perhaps unconsciously, for a final sign, a squeeze of the hand, a word of validation. It did not come. Christian the X died as he lived, on his own terms, locked inside his own fortress. On April 20th, 1947, the king drew his final breath. The Iron King was gone. The silence that fell over the room was no longer the predatory silence of his judgment. It was the final, empty silence of death. The moment Christian's heart stopped, the machinery of the state kicked into gear. There was no time for Frederick to process his complicated trauma. He was no longer the crown prince. He was the king. The weight of the crown, which he had dreaded for so long, was now physically upon his head. The proclamation of a new king in Denmark is a ritual of stark simplicity. There is no coronation, no placing of a crown upon the head in a church. The prime minister simply steps out onto the balcony of Christiansborg Palace and proclaims the death of the old king and the rise of the new one to the crowd below. On April 21st, 1947, the day after his father's death, Frederick IX stepped out onto that balcony. The square was a sea of black-clad mourners. Prime Minister Knud Christensen stepped forward and shouted the traditional formula 3 times to the 4 corners of the compass. King Christian X is dead. Long live King Frederick IX. And then something extraordinary happened. The new king, the giant sailor with the tattoos and the broken confidence, looked out at his people. He saw the sea of faces, tens of thousands of them, looking up at him not with judgment, but with hope. The emotions that his father had spent 50 years trying to suppress, the sensitivity, the softness, the humanity, suddenly rushed to the surface. Contemporary descriptions emphasize how visibly moved he was, grief, relief, and fear breaking through protocol. He didn't just shed a polite tear, he cried openly. He was overwhelmed by the grief, the relief, the terror, and the sheer magnitude of the moment. In the world of Christian X, this public display of emotion would have been a disgrace. It would have been proof of weakness. But to the Danish people standing in the square in 1947, it was electric. They saw a man who felt. They saw a human being, not a statue. They cheered him. They cheered his tears. In that moment of vulnerability, Frederick unknowingly shattered his father's legacy. He proved that a king could be human. The toxic model of monarchy, the aloof, terrifying patriarch, died on that balcony along with Christian X. But the ghost of the father does not vanish just because the son is crowned. In the weeks and months following the funeral, Frederick struggled to inhabit the role. He moved into the king's office, sitting at the same desk where he had been berated so many times. The shadow of Christian X hung heavy in the corners of the room. Frederick would reportedly catch himself checking his watch obsessively or flinching when a door slammed, expecting the old man to walk in and demand an explanation. The funeral itself was a grand state affair, a final pageant for the man who loved pageants. Christian X was laid to rest in Roskilde Cathedral, the burial place of Danish kings. He was placed in a sarcophagus of stone, fitting for a man who had made himself into a monument. As the heavy stone lid was lowered, sealing the family tyrant away in the dark, the era of the absolute patriarch was formally buried. Yet, the scars on the living remained. Frederick IX would spend the rest of his reign trying to be the anti-Christian. He became the sailor king, the man who conducted the Royal Danish Orchestra in his shirt sleeves, the man who let newspapers photograph him helping his daughters with their homework. He dismantled the rigid protocol of Amalienborg. He allowed laughter at the dinner table. He turned the monarchy from a military regiment into a family business. But psychologists tell us that we often swing to the opposite extreme of our trauma. Frederick's rejection of his father's style was not just a choice, it was a survival mechanism. He had to be different because to be like Christian X would have been to destroy himself. He drank too much, perhaps to quiet the voice of his father in his head. He smoked heavily. He governed with a light touch. sometimes too light, leaving the heavy lifting to the politicians, terrified of repeating his father's mistake of the Easter crisis. The story of Christian X's final years and death is the story of a Pyrrhic victory. He won the war against Hitler, but he lost the peace with his family. He died revered by millions who never met him, and feared by the few who knew him best. He left his son a kingdom that was intact, but a soul that was fractured. As Denmark moved into the modern era of the 1950s, an era of jazz design and social democracy, the memory of Christian X began to undergo a strange transformation. The family tyrant faded from view, hidden behind the hero on horseback. The national myth required a hero, and Christian X filled the role perfectly. The stories of the dinner table terror, the psychological abuse, the coup of 1920, these were whispered, then forgotten, then buried in the archives. It was easier to remember the statue than the man, but a statue casts a long shadow. And as Frederick IX settled into his reign, he found that the hardest part of being king was not ruling the country. It was ruling the ghost of the man who came before him. The toxic legacy of Christian X was not just a chapter in a history book. It was the DNA of the family, a genetic code of trauma that would take generations to rewrite. The Iron King was dead, but the echo of his boots still rang in the hallways of the palace, a reminder that the past is never truly dead. It is not even past. The sarcophagus in Roskilde Cathedral was sealed. The heavy oak doors of the crypt were closed, and the stone effigy of the king was left to stare eternally at the vaulted ceiling. But in the psychology of a family, a tyrant does not die when his heart stops. He dies only when his victims stop hearing his voice in their heads. For King Frederick IX, the new monarch of Denmark, the death of Christian X in 1947 was not an end, but the beginning of a long, painful exorcism. The Iron King was gone, but the vacuum he left was immense, a silence that demanded to be filled with something other than fear. The final act of this tragedy is not about death, but about the messy, beautiful, and imperfect resurrection of a family. It is the story of how a son, damaged by decades of belittlement, chose to dismantle his father's legacy not with a hammer, but with a hug. Frederick IX's reign, which lasted from 1947 to 1972, was a conscious, deliberate rebellion against the ghost of Christian X. If Christian was the embodiment of the 19th century Prussian drill sergeant, Frederick became the avatar of the 20th century Scandinavian social democrat. He did not just change the style of the monarchy, he changed its soul. He banished the terrifying silence of the dinner table. He replaced the stiff military uniforms with naval blazers and comfortable sweaters. He was known to manage the affairs of state with a pipe in his mouth and a drink in his hand, projecting an air of relaxed approachability that would have given his father an apoplectic stroke. The most profound shift occurred in the nursery. Christian X had viewed children as cadets to be drilled. Frederick viewed them as people to be loved. He and Queen Ingrid raised their 3 daughters, Margrethe, Benedicta, and Anne-Marie, in an atmosphere that was shockingly normal. The king was often seen sitting on the floor playing with them, reading to them, or helping them with their schoolwork. Photographs from the 1950s show a family that is physically affectionate, leaning on one another, laughing with open mouths. Images that were a direct refutation of the stiff, frozen portraits of the previous generation. Frederick was proving that authority did not require distance. He was the anti-Christian, a king who derived his dignity from his humanity rather than his rank. This shift was not merely aesthetic. It had constitutional consequences that reshaped Danish history. By 1953, it became clear that Frederick and Ingrid would have no sons. Under the Salic law that Christian X had rigidly upheld, the crown would pass to Frederick's younger brother, Prince Knud, and then to Knud's sons. But Frederick looked at his eldest daughter, Margrethe, bright, artistic, and intelligent, and saw a future queen. In a move that would have been unthinkable to his father, Frederick supported the change in the Act of Succession. He allowed the matter to go to a referendum. He trusted the people to decide. The 1953 Constitution, which allowed for female succession, was the ultimate victory of the soft son over the hard father. Christian X had believed that only a man, a warrior, could hold the sword of state. Frederick proved that a woman, armed with intelligence and empathy, could hold it just as well. When Margrethe II eventually ascended the throne in 1972, she did so as the product of her father's love, not her grandfather's discipline. The line of the family tyrant was broken. The line of the daisy, Margrethe's nickname, had begun. However, we must not let the pendulum swing too far and dismiss Christian X entirely as a villain. History demands nuance. As we stand back and view the full arc of his life, a difficult truth emerges. The very qualities that made him a monster in the private sphere were the qualities that made him a savior in the public one. This is the central paradox of the great man in history. The traits we value in a crisis, unyielding stubbornness, absolute self-belief, a refusal to compromise, a binary view of right and wrong, are often pathological in everyday life. Christian X had a personality disorder that made him incapable of negotiation. In a marriage, this is a disaster. In a parliament, it is a nuisance. But in the face of Nazism, it was a superpower. When the German Wehrmacht marched into Copenhagen, they brought with them a machinery of compromise. They wanted a model protectorate. They wanted a king who would be reasonable, who would see the nuance of the new order. If Christian X had been a more flexible man, a more empathetic man, he might have tried to understand the German position. He might have tried to get along. Instead, his colossal narcissism saved the nation's honor. He did not compromise because he did not believe the Nazis were his equals. He treated Hitler not as a terrifying conqueror, but as a rude guest who was wearing the wrong clothes. That specific brand of aristocratic arrogance, so toxic at the dinner table, became the shield behind which the Danish soul took shelter. We must ask ourselves, could a nice man have ridden that horse every day? Could a man sensitive to the feelings of others have withstood the pressure of the Easter crisis or the telegram crisis? Perhaps not. It took a man made of stone to stand against a tank. The tragedy is that he remained stone when he came home to his wife and children. He could not turn it off. He was a weapon that could not be sheathed, cutting the people who tried to hold him. Today, in the center of Copenhagen stands an equestrian statue of Christian X. It is heroic. The bronze king sits high on his horse, looking out over the city he refused to abandon. Tourists stop to take photos told by guides about the king who rode alone. It is a rightful tribute. He deserves the bronze, but if you walk a few streets away to the royal archives, you find the other legacy. You find the letters of a desperate crown prince begging for money. You find the diaries of a queen walking on eggshells. You find the silence between the lines of the official court circulars. This legacy is not made of bronze, it is made of scar tissue. The story of Christian X serves as a grim autopsy of the traditional masculine ideal. He was the ultimate patriarch, provider, protector, punisher. He succeeded in the first two roles and failed catastrophically in the third. He protected the state but punished his blood. His life forces us to question the price of heroism. If saving a kingdom requires the emotional destruction of a family, is the price too high? There is no easy answer. The thousands of Danish Jews who escaped to Sweden under the moral umbrella he held up might say the price was worth it. The son who shook with fear at the sound of his father's footsteps might disagree. In the end, the family tyrant was a man trapped in his own armor. He built a fortress of rules to keep the chaos of the world at bay, not realizing that he had locked himself in with his own demons. He died without ever really knowing his children, without ever letting his guard down, without ever experiencing the messy, chaotic joy of unconditional love. He was a king in every inch of his being, but he was a pauper in matters of the heart. The final image of this story should not be the king on the balcony, nor the king in the coffin. It should be the image of the dining table at Amalienborg in the late 1950s. The room is the same, the high ceilings, the chandeliers, the portraits of ancestors looking down. But the sound has changed. King Frederick is at the head of the table, a cigarette in one hand, conducting an invisible orchestra with the other. Queen Ingrid is laughing. The three princesses are talking over one another, sharing stories of their day. The soup is perhaps a minute late, and nobody cares. The ghost of Christian X is still there, lurking in the shadows of the cornices, checking his phantom watch, disapproving of the noise, the disorder, the lack of discipline. But nobody is looking at him anymore. The living have chosen life. The tyranny of silence is broken, washed away by the simple, radical act of a family enjoying their dinner. The hero on the horse belongs to history now, cold and magnificent in the square. But the home belongs to those who learned that being a good king is nothing compared to the glory of being a good father. The long winter of the patriarch is over. The spring has finally come.